Hello and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. Today we're going to take a look at replacing the stairs on my front porch. Now the reason I'm replacing the stairs is that I had a landscaper come in recently and put in this nice paver based walkway for me. Before he was here to do the job, I took my old stairs off of the porch. Those were just made of scrap wood from when the house was built 10 years ago. Now they were actually in pretty good shape other than needing a coat of paint. But rather than put the old stairs back on, I figured I would rebuild them with pressure-treated risers and use Trex decking for the treads. So as you can see, I'm starting the process of laying out the new stair risers, but let's take a closer look at some of the details involved with that. So the first thing I need to figure out here is the rise and run of the stairs. So the basic layout of the stairs is that the porch surface, of course, is the top landing. I'm going to have another step right about here, and a second step here, and then of course the ground down here. Now to figure out the run, I first want to know how wide I want to make each tread. So in my case, I'm going to use two Trex boards side by side to form each step. And those end up measuring about 11 inches when they're butted together. So because I'm going to be building two steps, that's 11 inches for each step, so 22 inches total run. So I've got my level set up here on the porch, and I've got it extended 22 inches from the fascia board of the porch to kind of simulate the run of the stairs. Now I've also checked to see if the porch surface is level, and in this case it is. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is take a couple height measurements to determine my rise. So I'll first take a height measurement at the surface of the porch, and it looks like we are at 25 inches here. And then what I'll do is take a measurement out here at the end of the run and see if it's the same. And what we're doing is we're checking to see if there's any slope to the ground that we'll need to account for when determining the rise of the stairs. So in my case, both measurements are about 25 inches. Now the stairs are going to be 6 feet wide here between these two porch posts. So I'm going to want to take measurements along the way just to make sure everything is even across. Now I've already taken all those measurements, and I found that the height is pretty consistent between the porch surface and the end of the run over here. It's about 25 inches, give or take a quarter inch or so, probably due to variations in the pavers down there. So in my case, I'm not going to worry too much about trying to compensate for that. I think it's going to work itself out just fine. So since the measurement is 25 inches, if I divide that by 3, it comes out to about 8.3. And we'll just round off and call it 8¼ inches. So the run of each stringer is going to be 11 inches, and the rise is going to be about 8¼ inches. So before I lay out my 2x12 stringer, what I did is I made myself a template out of cardboard just to check the fit and make sure everything works out before I lay out and cut an expensive piece of lumber. So taking a look at the template up against the porch here, I think everything looks the way that I want it to. The rise of each step should work out to be about 8¼ inches. Each tread will be 11 inches wide, and that'll give me the 22 inch of run that I'm looking for. So you can see I've got a framing square laid out on my 2x12 stringer. Now, the way I've set this up is that I've set up my rise over here on this side, and I've got the 8¼ inch mark even with the edge of the board here. And then over here is my run, or my 11 inch dimension, which is also even to the edge of the board here. And this of course forms the rise and the run. You can see I've also got a piece of scrap wood clamped to my framing square so that I can just quickly draw my lines and then move on without having to remeasure everything. Okay, so now I can just slide this down the board, and I'll line up the 11 inch mark here to the end of the line that I just drew, and then I'll keep making my treads as I go along. So I finished laying out the 2x12. Because I'm using a 12-foot long piece of lumber, it's a little hard to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my individual stringers out of the board before I actually cut the notches in them. I think that's going to just make things a little bit easier to work with for me. Okay, now that I've got the board cut down to a manageable length, I'll cut the rest of the angles out now. So one thing I want to mention about cutting the notch here, you can see I've stopped the blade right at the intersection of the perpendicular line that forms the other side of the notch. Now what I'll do is come back and cut the other way. Now what's going to happen is because of the curvature of the blade, at the bottom of the board it won't cut all the way through, but what I'll do is I'll finish the cut with a back saw. Now the other thing I could have done is I could have run the blade a little bit past the line in both cuts, but then I'd have a visible saw curve here, and I don't want that. I want a nice clean corner. So you can see here we're looking at the bottom of the board, and you can see that the cuts stop short. So what I'll do now is flip this over and use a back saw just to finish those cuts. So I'm almost done cutting the first stringer out, but I do have one more edge to cut. Now you may recall from the template that the bottom rise is less than the top rise. It's a little counterintuitive. This sits on the ground, and then we're also going to take into account the height of the plank that's going to be up here that forms the tread. So the overall height from here to here is going to be my 8 1/4 inches. So really what ends up happening is this rise here, which is measured at 8 1/4, really starts from the height of the Trex decking that's going to be here, so another inch up. So if you were to measure from where the Trex starts to here, this would be 7 1/4, and then another piece of Trex, that would be 8 1/4. So the upshot of all that is that my first rise is only 7 1/4 inches instead of the 8 1/4 that my second rise and the third formed by the porch fascia ends up being. Okay, so as you can see, I've got the first stringer cut, and I've got it laid up against the porch here just to double check everything. Now I did double check all the measurements. It's right about where I want it to be, so I think I'm good to go to make the rest of them. Now, because I'm going to have 6 foot wide stairs, and because I'm using Trex planks, which are relatively thin and flexible, I'm going to have one stringer every 12 inches or so. So I'm going to make 6 more of these for a total of 7. As you can see, I've got the stringers cut and ready to go. Now I've just got them sort of dry fit against the porch here for now, just to check my spacing. I've got them 12 1/2 inches on center to take up the 75 1/4 inch span that I have here. So since everything looks good, what I think I'll do is transfer some measurements to the porch fascia so that I can get everything lined up and start installing these. So you can see I've snapped a line to set the height of each of the stringers. Now you can see that there's actually 2 here, and this is where the old adage, measure twice, cut once, comes into play. When I did my first measurement, I double checked it and realized it was wrong, so I put the second line just a little bit above the first one, and now I think I've got everything dialed in. So what I'll do now is pick the 2 best looking stringers to put on the outer edges, the ones with the least knots and best corners, because those are the ones that you're going to see when you're looking at the steps. All the other ones, of course, will be hidden. So I'm going to be screwing these things to my porch as opposed to nailing them for a couple of reasons. The first being that I don't have a power nailer, and trying to nail these by hand would be kind of hard. And the second is that if I ever want to take these off the porch again for some reason, I'll be able to unscrew them. So anyway, what I'm going to do now is drill some pilot holes in the stringers just to make screwing them in a little easier and to help prevent the wood from cracking. So I'm going to start off on the top here, and I'm going to drill one hole at roughly a 45-degree angle. And then I've got rough measurements on each side of the stringer. On this side I've gone down 3/4 of an inch and 2 3/4. On this side I've gone down 1 inch and 3 inches just to prevent the screws from hitting each other when they go in. So you can see I've got the stringer lined up and ready to go. I've got some 2.5 inch exterior decking screws that I'm going to use, and we'll just get this thing attached. So now that I have the first stringer in place, I'm going to keep measuring these out so that I've got them 12.5 inches on center and attach them like I did the first one. Now the next thing I'm going to do before I do any more construction work is to paint the 2 outside stringers. It's just going to be easier to get that white paint on those before I start attaching the treads and the kick plates. Because this is bare wood, I've put a coat of primer on there first, and then I'll go over it with probably 2 coats of regular exterior paint. Anyway, while I wait for the primer to dry, I'm going to measure out and cut the kick plates. So what I'm using for the kick plates is this PVC trim board that I picked up at Home Depot. I put this stuff on my back stairs a couple years ago off my deck, and it's held up pretty well. Because it's PVC, it won't rot, and it doesn't need to be painted, and if it gets dirty you can just kind of scrub it and it'll come clean. So anyway, the width of the first board that I bought happens to be the exact width that I need for the bottom stair. So all I have to do is cut this to length. Now the second board, the only width I was able to get was closer to 9 inches, so I'm going to have to rip that one down before I can put it in place and cut it to length, of course. So I'll do that now while this paint is drying. so I forgot to turn my camera on for this bit, but this is the wider of the two trim boards. This one was about 9 inches wide, and I needed it 8 1/4. So I measured out the correct distance, used my guide fence here, which you can see, clamped that down to the board and the table, and used my circular saw to rip this down to 8 1/4. So now that I have a couple of coats of primer and a couple of coats of exterior paint on here, I'm going to get these kick plates installed. So the first thing I noticed is when I started to try and line this up to the end of the stringer, I noticed that the stringer is actually twisted a little bit. I guess there was a twist in the board. I didn't realize it. I might have used one of these other ones on the outside. Anyway, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this thing and cut the board just to kind of cheat it so it doesn't look like it's hanging out. Before I do that, what I want to do is I want to make sure I square up the stringer here as best I can, and then I'm going to get the top edge of the kick plate lined up with the top edge of the stringer here, and then I'll use my pencil and I'm just going to mark where the end of the stringer is in relationship to the end of the kick plate. And now I can just bring that over to the miter saw and cut it to kind of match the board. So I've got the kick plate cut to match the angle on the stringer now. So what I'm going to do now is just put in one screw to hold the kick plate in place so that I can check the other side for squareness. The screws I'm going to use to attach this are these stainless steel trim screws, and you can see that the head is painted white so that they'll blend into the trim board nicely. So I ended up having to cut a taper on this side of the kick plate as well, but I think everything's pretty well lined up at this point. So what I'll do now is just double check and make sure I've got this stringer square to the porch, and then I'll put one screw in the end over here just to hold it. So what I'll do now is go across and check that each stringer is square to the fascia on the porch, and then I'll put one screw in the top just to hold everything together, and then I'll go back and put probably 2 more screws in to hold the fascia on. Okay, so I've got the second kick plate lined up, and it looks like I've got a slight taper on both ends just like I did on the first one, so I'm going to mark it and trim it to match the stringers. As you can see, I've got the kick plates all set, so I'm going to go get my Trex boards and figure out the steps now. So next up I need to figure out how long I need to cut these boards to. So the first thing I'll do is take my square and get this lined up to the edge of the porch board here so that I can match the same overhang on the step. If I check this overhang, it's about 1 15/16 inches or so 2 inches. So then what I've done is I've measured over 1 15/16 inches from the edge of this stringer and made just a little mark on my fascia board on the porch here so I can see it. And then what I'll do is just run the tape measure along here. From this measurement, it looks like I want to cut this thing about 79 1/8 or so inches. As you can see, I've got the steps cut the length, and the length is just about perfect. But you may be able to tell that the front overhang here is not ideal. In fact, it's set back a little bit. Now, when I originally planned this all out, I thought I had planned for a slight overhang of the steps, sort of something like that. So what I did wrong is that I forgot to account for the fact that there is no kick plate on the fascia board of the porch. And what I should have done is I should have cut each one of these stringers back about 1/2 inch on this surface, and then everything would have worked out the way that I wanted it to. But I have a solution to kind of cheat my way out of the problem here. I've got this piece of PVC trim board that's left over from cutting this kick plate here. So what I can do is just slip this behind the top step here, and then butt everything up like this. And I think we'll be good to go. So what I'll do now is get that positioned, trimmed, and screwed in with some more of those stainless steel screws, and then we'll move on with attaching the steps. So I've got my cheater strip in place behind this top step, and I'm going to line this up to the edge of the porch again and make sure I've got it where I want it. So what I'll do now is attach the step to the stringer using these composite decking screws that are made for Trex. Now, luckily I had a bunch of leftovers from when I built my deck a few years ago. So as you can see, I've got the 2 top steps all fastened down, and it's time to put the 2 bottom ones in. You can see I've got it squared up and aligned to the top ones, so we'll throw some screws in here and I think we'll be done. Okay, so that's pretty much it. The stairs are done. Now at some point I would like to put a railing on the steps here. We don't need it by code in my town, but I think it would be nice to have. But I've got so many other projects going on around the house here, and lots of overtime at work, so I think I'll save that either for the fall or maybe next summer. We'll see. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. If you'd like to support my channel in another way, please consider visiting my Amazon store, which you'll find linked in the description below. Thanks for watching.